Maybe that's a good point to start from my side with a proposal for this webinar, even before welcoming all you here, suggesting a little digital etiquette, so to say. And my very simple proposal would be first that you mute yourself, that so to say the default status is that your microphone is muted, that we don't get too much background noises. And secondly, if that somehow works for you, to have your video on so that we can see your face and that we may see you as co-hosts or co-facilitators if you're waving and indicating, for example, if you have a question. That would be, so to say, the very basic start in terms of a digital etiquette. I also can invite you that particularly throughout the presentation, the starting presentation by my colleague Gijs Dirks, that you may pose comments or questions already in the Zoom chat. And I will be attentive and I will keep an eye on that. I suggest that we keep, so to say, immediate questions right for after the presentation, that we so to say not immediately interrupt with the first presentation, but that we summarize them and we will have enough time to discuss questions and get into a bit of a more interactive part of that session. I think that would be fantastic because that also helps us in terms of the quality of the recording that we will do here. So I'm also, in the name of Adina, I'm again informing all of you that this session will be recorded. First of all, for internal purposes of the project itself, but also with the idea of later publishing it on the project website. Formally, I assume we would need your official consent to do so. I leave it to Adina or others to sort this out. But at least I herewith have informed you that the recording of this session, so your face may be visible there, will end up on the project website of the WASTE-FEW project. I think that's maybe it for the start. I just quickly repeat my proposal as there are additional people coming in. I repeat my proposal in terms of a digital etiquette, that I invite you to have your microphone muted while your video camera is on. So that we may also see you if you are raising your hand and having a question, for example, and want to participate in a later discussion. And you can also use the group chat during that session. Now I would officially then start and welcome you on behalf of the, while still more and more people are coming in. So welcome everyone to this webinar on behalf of the WASTE-FEW International Research Consortium. Maybe in a nutshell, this project brings together diverse partners from all over the globe in a 3-year research project that's particularly addressing the circular economy and, so to say, inefficiencies with waste and materials at the food, energy, water nexus. And myself, I'm Timo van Beert. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Rotterdam, and I'm working with the Dutch Research Institute for Transitions. And this institute is a partner among many others in this project. And I leave it with this very short introduction. I'm very happy that for this webinar, we could win my colleague Gijs Dirks, and I'm introducing him in a second, to give us a presentation because he is strongly engaged with a project in our institute that is reflecting about, so to say, the state of transitioning towards a circular economy. And I'm very much looking forward seeing your slides and hearing you speaking about it, Gijs. Gijs Dirks is a senior researcher and consultant at the Dutch Research Institute for Transitions. He combines transition sciences and practice, particularly with policy implications. And the project that I mentioned that he will be mainly speaking about is called Staat van Transitie. That's the Dutch title, so the translation would be State of Transition. So it refers rather to the national level of where in a transition towards the circular economy are we, or what are the phases? And it's on behalf of the Dutch Ministry of Infrastructure and Water. So it touches upon a lot of aspects that we are also dealing with in our project. And as I mentioned earlier, I will give the floor now to Gijs Dirks for his presentation. He will share his screen, I assume, with the presentation. And please collect your questions or comments, and we will get to them after the presentation or post them in the chat, and then I can pick them up in the discussion later on. Gijs, please go ahead.
Hi, Timo. Hi, everyone. Thank you for the invitation. Nice to be here. It's always a challenge to keep everyone's attention digitally, especially on a Friday afternoon. I also find it challenging to present with the same amount of energy as you do in front of live audiences, but I'll do my best. This is the best part because now I can see all of you. After I start sharing my screen, your faces disappear, so it becomes even more difficult. And on that note, I do have a question for Timo. How long did you expect the presentation to be? And is there an opportunity maybe to cut it into pieces? So small discussions in between.
That we could do that as well. I think in general, if it would be one, I would suggest not to go longer than 30 minutes in total. Rather stick to 20. But if you say, here's a first chunk of information that's roughly, I don't know, 10 minutes, and then we open the floor a bit, that's absolutely fine. I think in total, we had even scheduled 2 hours for the whole session. It could also be shorter, but I think we could go until 5 o'clock Central European time.
All right, let's see if we have enough energy to keep
right.
that going. But I'll start then with sharing my screen. There we go. All right, as Timo already introduced to you, I'm mainly going to be talking about a project we are doing for the Ministry of Infrastructure and Water in the Netherlands to assess the state of transition towards a circular economy. And we do this in a very qualitative manner, where other institutes in the Netherlands are very much experts in quantitative data analysis. We take a more qualitative approach, and I'll get back to that in a bit. After a short introduction, I will zoom out a bit and tell a bit more about transition theory in a nutshell. We approach the circular economy as a transition, and I'll explain a bit more about what we mean by that. And then I'll discuss the research and consultancy we're doing for the ministry. And then we'll have an open discussion about what it could mean for your work, or what your reflections are on this, and what your feedback would be to us. I think you're all more of an expert in the circular economy than I am, so I'm quite excited to hear and get feedback from that perspective. First, an introduction of who I am. I think this is basically the timeline of my career so far, where I started in a very practice-oriented setting, in startups in the Netherlands in the energy sector, being very lean, agile, and all that stuff, until we, of course, beautifully failed in our attempts to make the world a better place. And after that, I went into academia. I did a PhD in transition studies and innovation sciences at Imperial College in London. And after my time in academia, I spent some time at a Dutch think tank, the Rathenau Institute it's called, which is in between science and policy. And finally, I ended up where I belong at Drift, which is very much a place I enjoy being at, because they really try to combine science and practice. And where Timo is, I guess, more representative of our academic circle, I am more tilted towards the practice-oriented side of things, and that also will be a clear thread throughout this presentation. Rachel is, of course, also here, and she's a PhD student, so very much an academic part of our organization. So this is Drift. You already know it, so I won't spend too much time on this because Timo just said we are a partner. We are academics. We like to advance transition theory, but at the same time, we are very much engaged citizens who want to accelerate and steer transitions towards a sustainable society. Transdisciplinary work, different themes, different skills. And of course, we are embedded in the broader academic community of transition studies that some of you might very well be aware of already. So quickly, a dive into transition theory. What are transitions? I think I always start this by taking a very simple approach. That is from the observation that our society is organized around certain societal functions, such as energy, mobility, healthcare, finances. And we normally optimize these systems. We are really good at making them better, more efficient, smarter, and safer. But every few generations, these systems change radically. The path dependencies, these incremental step-by-step improvements that led to the optimization, now provides to a lock-in. So it's very difficult to change the course of these systems once they are such like in an adult stage, when they are very good, efficient in what they do. Ultimately, the pressure becomes too great, and in an erratic system change leads to a new dynamic equilibrium. So these, I guess, these processes are what can be described as transitions, and these happen all the time. These are not only happening now, but also happened in the past. And there are many examples of historic transitions that I think were very influential in shaping transition studies in the early days. Because you can learn a lot by looking at transitions from the past, because they already finished, and only after they finished you can really tell whether it was a transition or not. So I always enjoy to briefly dive into one historic transition, just to get into the mind of a transition academic, and to familiarize ourselves with like a common language that we tend to use. And one quite influential study was by Frank Gils, and it was the transition from the sailboat to the steamship. And what I personally like about this transition is that it sounds like such an obvious transition. Like, why would we not transition from a sailboat to a steamship? The advantages are obvious. And also it seems like a simple, like, technological transition. So it can't be that complex, right? It's the transitions we study now are much more dynamic, addressing all these societal issues other than just technologies. But if you dive deep into this case study, you'll find that even these types of transitions are rather complex, and it took a long time for them to materialize. So the first experiments around a steamship already happened late 18th century, where they showed great promise for speed, regularity, predictability, reliability, and comfort. But as I said, this was not a story of simple technological substitution. There was a long phase of pre-development where the inventors of the steamship encountered many, first of all, technological issues. You had the paddle wheel at first, which was very difficult when you would cross open waters because there were waves and then the paddle wheels would lose traction. You had vibrations because of the engine, so the wooden ships would be damaged easier, and when they would move to steel ships, then the compass had issues. And because it had such a big engine, you had less room for freight, and this was the main use of big ships in the open waters. But apart from these technological issues, there were many cultural issues that had to be reckoned with. The cabins that were always part of the back ship had to be moved to the midship. That sounds like a stupid detail to us, but for many of the rich paying customers, this was a big deal because you would never move to the midship. That's just not what you do. So they would still prefer sailing boats for a long time. And there were many institutional issues. How would you set a premium to ensure your freight? Lloyd's was already around in that time, and they were very good in ensuring big freights that would go all over the world in sail ships, but they didn't know how to ensure freights that were in a steamship. So there was a big obstacle. Yet the infrastructural issues, So would my ship be able to enter a port where the water's deep enough? And if my ship was there, would there be coal to refuel my ship? So talk about range anxiety in the 19th century. And the most difficult one to overcome was, of course, that of skills and competencies, because there was a big industry of shipbuilders, but that was a very traditional industry that existed for many generations, and they were very good at wood crafting and not so much at making ships of steel. So in that long time of pre-development, alternatives developed in what we call niches, small protective environments where different rules shaped innovation. For instance, there was a premium that people wanted to pay for mail to be delivered in time. And especially in the UK, you had the canals that were very much suited for coal-fired ships, steamships. So there, these ships could develop. And for personal transport, this became more and more a popular option, especially for inland waters. Interesting enough, the regime, as we call it, the dominant practices, they did not go without a fight. As to say, the best sail ships were developed in the 19th century. I think the most iconic example is the Tea Clipper. Beautiful ships that were built around that time and that were extremely fast in bringing those first harvests of tea from India to the UK. So they were not worried too much about all those slow coal ships, steamships that still had all these disadvantages. And we also see there was a very long period where there was a search for what the new normal might be, in which there were a lot of hybrid forms as well. And in the end, the big trigger that made steamships really break through and become the new normal was a external, what we then call landscape development, that triggered the transition. So in 1848 was a very special year where the gold rush in California, the revolutions in mainland Europe, and the potato famine in Ireland came together and triggered a huge flow of people that wanted to leave Europe and move to the US. And that really created a market for large-scale passenger transport. And these niches, these small steamships that had developed in the margins, were now ready to fill that demand in a much better way than the sailboats could do at that time. So what we learned from all these historical cases, this is just one, is that transitions are long-term processes. They take 1-2 generations to materialize, which is of course like a ballpark figure. They involve radical and structural changes in not only the structure of our society, but also our culture and practices. We tend to look at them at a system level, and they involve high levels of complexity and uncertainty. And they are often triggered by external pressures, so both top-down, so these are these major developments in world and society, and bottom-up. And this is a very influential way in that has dominated the way we talk about transitions, where we talk about the regime as the dominant system, the dominant structures, cultures, and practices, but that most often the initial change is triggered by a combination of niche developments, the spaces for new innovations or ideas of seeds of change to develop, and the broader landscape macro level developments that put then pressure on the regime and make these niches break through, as it were. This was just a very short introduction. I felt I needed to give some context about what we do at Drift. I'm not sure if that was very new or very old for you, and maybe if there are already questions about this part of the presentation.
Yes, thank you very much, Gijs. We can open up for a short question and answer session. I would invite you to give me a hand signal, and then I would mention your name and ask you to unmute. Esther, you unmuted yourself already. That sounds like an upcoming question.
Yeah, nice to be here with you. Thank you, Keith, for your presentation. And I'm sure your papers, I have taken a look at the research policy last one. Yeah? And we share a lot of theoretical and conceptual guidelines. It's not good, it's not bad, but it's interesting because I think the innovation studies and the path dependency approach and of course the niche and the multi-level approach are very interesting because they are capable to give us from all the places in the world a guide to understand the global transition process that is needed, but in developing countries like Brazil, and from Brazil, who have special contexts, yeah. But I think niches. I think René Camp and technological regimes, all these kind of approaches, they are very interesting, but they are not capable to catch up the functionalities and dysfunctionalities of developing countries. So we know that the transition system is national, it's local, regional, national economic blocks, but it's global. So what do you think about, and we can have some interaction, of course, after this section, this webinar. What do you think about the capability of this kind of pool of concepts about the relationships between local and national policies, national institutional capabilities to catch up innovation for the transition, not only technological transition, but the social organization for it, the organizational, the social organizational transition for sustainability, yeah, concerning the developing countries and the poor countries too. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, as I understand, two questions, like how to what extent do these concepts apply in a developing context, and the second question maybe more, or maybe was that the main question actually, and I think I don't like all those studies that basically copy paste this multi-level perspective to their context. And I think many transition scholars have stopped doing that a while ago already. This was a discussion that was really dominant 10 years ago, and luckily it's not that dominant anymore. So it's not taking multi-level perspective and apply it to the context of Brazil, because it doesn't work. It's a very different context. And often these frameworks are also developed on a particular technology or a particular domain. And it's not a model, it's purely a heuristic that you can use. And the reason why I presented it now is that I just wanted to explain where our language comes from. And I do think that in these heuristics that were developed early on within transition studies, there's an interesting language that does still stick. People do still talk about regimes and niches in terms of heuristics that can help you to make sense of what you then see in your own context. And I would be very hesitant to go any further than that. And I know there's a lot of interesting research now that's emerging about like transition studies in the developing context. I am unfortunately not an expert in that field. Then I would have to redirect you to some of my colleagues who are much better in that. So maybe that's something I would do like to follow up maybe with Timo and Rachel as well.
Yeah, thanks, Gijs. Very good points. Just to quickly add to this, Esther, you basically pointed your finger to so to say major critiques with the multi-level perspective. And the one that I heard in between the lines is the question of agency and power, for example, in terms of good or bad governance in the global south, which is a at least justifiable critique that this is somehow underrepresented or overlooked in this model. And secondly, you had this question about, so to say, the scale of reference, or the question of spatial scale or spatiality in this model. That's also a fair critique. But the main point I want to make is that for both aspects, there is, over the last years, a lot of work done already. And just to mention, for example, the work of our colleague Flor Avellino on power aspects and aspects of empowerment and politics of transition. And I'm happy to share some references there with you. So that's this one aspect. And the other aspect, there is for about the last 7 to 8 years, a rather young research stream within transition studies that's framed around the notion of the geography of transitions. For example, Bernhard Truffer, Lars Kuhnen, and other colleagues, and I'm also happy to share some references there. And these questions of, well, scale reference or cross-scale effects are starting to be addressed there. And maybe a last point, yes, I think the original, so to say, the first years of these models definitely had a strong Northwestern Hemisphere focus and reference, so to say. But also this has at least been acknowledged in more recent literature that there is a strong gap in addressing, for example, global South contexts. And just to name also one concrete example here, a colleague, Anna Wieczorek from the University of Eindhoven in the Netherlands has written at least a very nice overview paper about conducting transition studies in developing countries. And I'm also happy to share this reference later on. Back to you, Gijs. Or maybe, is there an additional immediate question at this point? Otherwise, I would please raise. Oh yes, Sue, please unmute yourself.
Okay, so I'm Sue from the UK. I'm also a physical geographer, so you'll have to excuse me if what I ask you is perhaps a bit naive. So I was interested that you said that this transition potentially takes quite a long time. Do you feel that transitions actually need a crisis in order to sort of begin this sort of transition, and that you could have one that, you know, you were talking about the oil tanker, and I understand that, but do you think there's a point at which the oil tanker takes a right-hand bend all of a sudden, and that the transition happens then?
I'm very happy that you asked me this question on a Friday afternoon. Right. It is a bit of a Friday afternoon question. Yeah, so they do take a long time, but I think the transitions we are worried about at the moment are also already ongoing for quite a long time. They have their roots 1, 2, maybe even 3 decades back. So the crisis moments that define transitions, and I think they have defined transitions in the past quite regularly for good and bad, are not events that like initiate a transition, but they do can be a important a watershed moment, I guess, that creates, like, finally puts enough pressure on the regime to open up, and for these new emerging alternatives that have been developing for quite some time already to break through. I think that would be the general consensus. And then how big that crisis needs to be, and whether crises are not also being used by the regime to reinforce the status quo is, of course, every time an ongoing discussion, and also today quite relevant. But yeah, they do play a big part in any transition, I'd say, historically at least. Shall I continue?
Yes, please.
For now, so the transitions we look at right now are very much inspired by a want or to transition towards sustainability. Responsible these persistent problems in modern societies, and there are beautiful definitions of what these transitions should be about and should not be about. They tend to be quite normative in a sense, and I don't necessarily think that's bad, but it's good to recognize that we are very much taking a normative stand often in that transition, and that needs to be acknowledged as well, I think, by anyone who studies them. So the transitions you all know about towards sustainable energy systems and towards sustainable mobility systems, and the transition, of course, you are involved in is the transition towards a circular economy. The frame we take with us when we then apply transition thinking to policy practice is really make sure that everyone understands that we are not talking about technological substitution, that these transitions are a process of co-evolution between all these economic, cultural, technological, and institutional development. I think that has been a message that's been repeated so often now that this is really in between years of most policymakers. And I think we often take it for granted how often this was not the case 20 years ago. During my PhD, I studied how policy documents talked about transitions 20 years ago, and that was very much in terms of like technological innovation that needs to be strengthened and more money towards I don't know, some guys in a lab somewhere thinking of new interesting innovations. By now, I think this idea that we need to change societal systems and that is a part of a broader set of interactions of different elements is now really not a message that needs a lot of convincing anymore, which is very good. Because transitions are complex and multidimensional, they are controversial and sensitive, they're deeply rooted in culture and institutions, which also means there are simply no simple solutions. This is also a message we continuously try to get across to policymakers, as they do ask you for simple solutions and easy take-home messages. But we're dealing with persistent problems. Solutions easily become part of the problem if you look for this quick fix. The initial reaction tends to be superficial, reactive, incremental, managing from the status quo and a focus on the short term. And I mean, the best example for that is, of course, how we dealt with mobility for a long time. From the 70s onwards, every time a road would clog up, we thought maybe one more lane could fix it. And by now, we do feel that this might not be the solution to many of our problems anymore. So I think at Drift and the broader transition studies community have tried to really better understand and also come to terms with these nature of the problems we are dealing with. This is a very important starting point then for what to do. So we basically say that we are dealing with complex adaptive systems. Societal systems are which basically means that they exhibit properties that cannot be traced back to the individual parts. And they're adaptive, which means they consistently change because of interactions with an open environment. They tend to rely on processes of co-evolution, so where different parameters of the system influence each other and build on each other with both positive and negative feedback loops. Alternatives are being selected on basis of variation and selection, so we tend to borrow a lot of terminology from natural systems, biological systems, to get our message across to policymakers, to help them think of society as were it a natural system, so to speak, and that these concepts that we tend to only apply to biological systems, natural systems, also apply to ideas, technologies, and human systems. So we have all these properties of complexity, the interdependencies, the co-evolution, uncertainty, nonlinearity. So what does this mean then for human intervention in these systems? The central message we also every time want to get across to policymakers, and we tend to sometimes overlook because we feel it is obvious, is that society cannot be managed, societal change cannot be planned, effects and causes are uncertain and unpredictable, but at the same time, small interventions can make a great difference. There's a power in diversity of learning and experimenting, and it's good and essential to try to get insights into long-term dynamics of societal change. So from this, the transition management philosophy basically originated as a new mode of governance for sustainable development. It's not about command and control, it's about trigger and accelerate transitions by playing into existing dynamics of change in society, taking complexity as an opportunity, and gaining insights into the system dynamics. So these are examples of the theory that has been developed in the field over those years, which I won't go into in much detail. Here I will explain a bit more about the approach we took at the State of Transition project for the ministry, and that is we used an X-curve to get an overview of all the dynamics in the current transition towards the circular economy as a starting point for policy intervention. Because if you break down transitions to its most simple form, you often get this S-curve where a lot of people talk about. This is also a dominant way of thinking in innovation studies, where it expresses a simplistic idea of nonlinearity, where there's a long phase of pre-development, then there's a tipping phase of reconfiguration towards new equilibrium, dynamic equilibrium. This is, of course, a very simplistic idea of what transitions are. And over the past couple of years, we have at Drift thought about how can we be a bit more specific about these transition dynamics we observe. And the main takeaway lesson is that, first of all, a transition is not only about upward dynamics, but it's a combination of upward and downward dynamics, and it can be divided into multiple phases. So that is how we moved from an S-curve to X-curve as a way of thinking about these dynamics, and the importance to not only think about the nice, cuddly upward dynamics of innovation and change, but also fundamentally address the importance of the established system and how that needs to be reconfigured or even phased out. So we also defined multiple phases in this, where from the upward dynamics, you first have this phase of, oh wait, there's still some Dutch in this, I see, of experimenting with radical new practices and radical new thinking that goes into a phase of acceleration, where alternatives are connecting, visible and accessible, where then is a phase of emergence of new structures that become visible. The need to transition is broadly accepted by society, in which you move towards the phases of institutionalization and stabilizing this new normal in new structures. And finally ending up with both tweaking and optimizing the new regime, as it were. Parallel to these dynamics are the dynamics of the downward curve, as to say, where first there is this idea that we're still optimizing the old. It's just improving what is already there, and there's no underlying essential doubt. Everything is still going well until like incidents lead to urgency. There's a destabilizing effect, which will then trigger a fundamental discussion about future directions. When then this new system emerges and becomes more visible, this also leads to chaos in the old system, where there are many contradictions and uncertainties that come to light, as well as opposing interests and conflict. This then needs to move into a phase of also breakdown, where we release former established order, the losers become visible, and at some point we'll also need to phase out certain practices, ideas, technologies, infrastructures, say goodbye, and also deal with these losses in a fair, equitable way, of course. This frame we try to apply in practice in this project called State of Transition. Why did we do this? This is really to help the people that make these decisions on how to intervene in transitions to zoom out and to get a more comprehensive understanding of all the transition dynamics. We sometimes jokingly say we try to take off their, I don't know the English word for this, but the horses usually wear these masks on the side of their...
the blinders.
The blinders. So take off the innovation blinders. And these innovation blinders that policymakers often wear is where they only focus on nurturing the new, the good, but without taking more comprehensive system dynamics of transitions into account. It also helps to create a more common frame of reference of language. What do we see? Is this really something new, or is this still optimizing the old system? And what does it represent? How can we interpret this? And from that discussion, policymakers can then reassess, prioritize, and identify more strategic actions. So how did we do this? This is really a qualitative approach to the state of transitions. We did desk research. We do expert interviews with people who have a more like up-to-date, which is very important, overview of what's going on currently. And we also did a number of what we then call co-creation sessions with civil servants, where we, with them, try to map out all the dynamics on this X-curve. And not unimportantly, there is quite a bit of own judgment, interpretation, and internal discussions on how to interpret what we see in terms of these this data. This is then an overview of the state of transition to the circular economy in the Netherlands, based on the research I just told you about. And what color are we calling this? Purple, red, pink, pinkish? I don't know even. These circles, they represent an amount of effort. And the state of transition to the circular economy was, I think, least advanced of all the transitions we looked at, because we did this also for mobility and energy. But in the Netherlands, what you see that when it comes to the circular economy, we still see a lot of effort in optimizing the old. So where we incinerate waste for renewable energy and say this is part of the circular economy, but really it is not something that, if you take future visions of the circular economy seriously, will be there in the future. There's a lot of mixing of recycled plastic into normal plastics, so that we get products with maybe 20% recycled plastics in them. We try to get higher recycling targets. It's all about efficiency in a sense, to collect even more so that we can then again incinerate most of that waste. But there is a lot of effort also on the side of experimentation and acceleration. Versnellen means acceleration in Dutch. For instance, in terms of experimenting, there's a lot of ideas around building with wood or chemical recycling, repair cafes, and companies really trying to get modular design into their products. And after having a lot of discussions internally and with experts, we did say that we find that there's more dynamic, there's more effort now in acceleration than in experimenting. And this is a subjective interpretation we took, because we found that the experiments we have been doing for quite some time already, and many of the principles of the circular economy we do know. And most efforts of companies or initiatives we see are trying to now bring that knowledge together and really get it into a new phase, where we do see a lot of new circular consumer products enter the market, where governments are trying to push this agenda by making ambitious transition agendas towards the circular economy, where they pinpoint towards iconic projects that they say this is really what we're trying to scale up now. At the same time, we do see a lot of destabilization as well. An important event for the circular economy was that China refuses to take foreign plastics and deal with them. So this was really now responsibility of Europe, and I think the US as well, to deal with it themselves. We have a long-standing infrastructure in the Netherlands that collects clothing we don't use anymore and then distributes it all over the world. Well, the rest of the world is now telling us, please keep it yourself, you're destroying domestic markets. So the prices of that is falling, also because the quality of our new clothing is falling. So the quantity of secondhand clothing increases, but the quality is down, so there's no business model anymore. And this old infrastructure is now crashing and are going out of business, which destabilizes the former way of doing things. And there's also this call for more extended producer responsibility, which is leading to some destabilization in the private sector. Emergence, we don't see a lot of like true emergence in the circular economy. It's still very at a starting point if you compare it to other transitions, but there is a trend that is definitely now becoming more visible to everyone, which is, I've called it the servicification of the economy. I'm not sure if it is a word in English, but the idea that now more and more products are being offered as a service, not only to consumers, but mostly, at least in the Netherlands, as business-to-business side of the economy. So in construction, for instance, you would offer the entire facade of a building as a service rather than as a product. And this is something that is really becoming mainstream. It's not the circular economy itself, but it is an important precondition for a circular economy. In terms of institutionalization, the most effort we have identified is, for instance, where a lot of public governmental bodies are institutionalizing procurement standards into their procurement strategies, or where universities are now institutionalizing the circular economy as a concept by offering master programs, etc., which sounds like a very silly point to make, but it does say something about the matureness of the concept. For instance, 10 years ago, most people in the Netherlands talked about cradle to cradle. Cradle to cradle never got to the point where it became institutionalized in the sense that there was a master's program completely dedicated to the circular economy. So these are small examples we give to then policymakers to say, well, there is something happening, that this is really becoming institutionalized in the long term. There's some examples of phase out, the ban or tax of single-use plastics, and the banning of landfills, or you cannot export waste anymore in the Netherlands if you cannot convincingly say that the countries you're exporting it to are then landfilling that waste. So, as a main conclusion of this state of transition to the circular economy, we said that there's a broad recognition by everyone that the linear economy is under pressure, but that's still very difficult to break through the dominant system. We're still optimizing with a big focus on recycling rather than the more value-added parts of the circular economy. We do see many activities around creating this new normal, where we say the emphasis has shifted from experimentation to acceleration, and where the servicification of the economy now is at a stage of emergence maybe. But circular is struggling to get past this idea of just recycling things better. the destabilization of this becomes somewhat visible, but there's no real felt chaos. In the end, if you're very honest and critical to what is now happening, everyone is still quite happy with this linear model that is still very dominant. And phase-out policy only finds a small place on the agenda and is very much targeted towards more symbolic issues such as single-use plastics, which can make a big difference, but on the whole scheme of what a circular economy could or should be is still marginal. A conclusion we ended up, well, co-producing, I guess, with the policymakers we work with, was I find interesting because it tells me something about the value about contrasting this upward and downward curve, because it really shows you that there are contrasting narratives of the circular economy. So it helped people within the ministry to make sense of how to interpret it, better recycling efforts or waste incineration. And the conclusion we came to is that the new circular world of radically different business models designed for recycling, high quality recycling and other forms of value retention still has too little interaction with the old circular world of better regulation of the waste phase. To accelerate the transition, there's still great need for guidance, focusing on both the emerging order, the established order, and the link between the upward and downward curve. From that, we started this assessment as of the state of the circular economy as a entry point for what to do now. How can we steer? And I will briefly go through this, but again, we use this X-curve as a frame of reference to then identify where can we actually steer as policymakers. So we can think of what needs to be built up, but we also can think of two other dynamics of what needs to be changed. What is there currently that needs to be with us in the future, and what is there currently that also needs to go and simply needs to be phased out. I think I'll skip this slide, but this, how we also often use this framework is to then say that, well, if you're in a different phase of transition, it also asks for different strategies. So if we're still in a phase where there's a lot of optimization and experimenting, maybe there's more need to connect front runners, problemize the status quo, and create new discourses, basically deepening this circular economy agenda. But if you're moving to a next phase, we need more attention toward niche regime interaction. That's basically the call the civil servants made to us as well, where we create a common agenda, shape broader coalitions, and basically broaden up this movement towards a circular economy. And if you are really moving towards a later phase in transition, it is really time to strongly focus on institutionalize what we need to take with us towards the new circular economy, shift norms on a large scale, and create mass. And this is how we drew lines between the different phases of transitions and how that then can help policymakers to strategize, to really think of, okay, where am I? Where's the dynamic? Where is my current activity on this X-curve? And how can I then move within this framework to move the transition forwards? I think I'll keep it at this. What we then also do, I just want to tell you, briefly show you other ways in which we use this X-curve approach. Is not only as an analytical tool for a research report, as I just showed you now, we also use it as a more playful tool with civil servants or with practitioners to say, okay, if this is the transition to the X-curve, where do you stand? Where would you position yourself on the curve? And maybe also, where do you want to go? So it becomes more dynamic. You move around and have a discussion about where do we actually want to put our efforts for the next year or so. And of course, you can become very creative with all these stickers and post-its until you drop, because that's also the consultancy part of me that then comes to light, where we really let go of the more rigorous academic approach of doing traditional science and really get into the mode of co-creation and activating an actionable research setting. Maybe we can try out this with you later to see where your project stands and where your activities are mainly focused. I think that would be a nice way of starting a discussion. But for now, I think I'll just stop talking for a bit because I haven't seen you in 50 minutes and I'm not even sure if my internet is still working or not. And I feel very isolated in this room.
Thank you, Gijs. I can assure you that at least I could hear you clear and loud, and that I could also see all your slides, and it was super interesting. Thank you very much for the presentation. I would say we first of all take 10 to 15 minutes for open question and answers and discussion, not only questions directly to Gijs, but also feel free to interact within the group, but so to say, opening up the plenum for immediate questions towards Gijs, but also, so to say, in a broader perspective among the whole group. And I would still ask you to quickly give me a sign, and then I can take a note. Yes, I see Dan waving. You would be first. Maybe one or two others who already have an immediate question. Jana would be next. Then, okay, let's start with Dan. Please unmute yourself, and then Jana afterwards.
Yes, thank you so much, Gijs. That was really, really very interesting. I've got lots of questions, and I think I'm going to have to follow up after this session. But just a first question then on winners and losers. Have you done any work on looking at when you're trying to transition from old paradigms to new paradigms? Obviously there are going to be losers and winners. Have you looked into that and how you accommodate? So an example could be the coal industry and having to provide jobs for when you're trying to transition away from coal to other renewables. That's just one example, but obviously there's going to be examples in every single sector. Is that something that you guys have looked at? I'd love to hear. As I say, I've got lots of other questions, but I'll just leave it at that.
Thanks.
So,
Gijs,
I'll quickly try to answer it, but since it's about the coal phase out, I will definitely have to give the word to Timo as well on this. But I think what really helped by introducing this X curve in the discussions we have with, for instance, then policymakers, is that it's all of a sudden it's explicitly on the table. So for a long time we talked about transition in terms of trying to get to the new normal, right? To support innovation and to move forwards. And then only later it became clear, oh wait, there are also maybe some redistributional effects here, and maybe there are also some losers involved. And by making that clear from the beginning, you can address it proactively, right? So a concrete example, let me think of what would be the best one here. Timo, can you tell me something about the project you're doing in Germany with the phase out of coal? Because then I'll try to think of a good example, which is not research related, more practice oriented.
Sure. Yes. I first of all can second and back up what Gijs just said, that it's first of all a great idea, Dan, to further sort of say think about how to use tools like this to particularly or explicitly address winners and losers. I think we could also sort of say think further about this, but I fully support what Gijs said, that at least making explicit that there is this sort of say inherent necessity in these long-term change processes for decline, that you have to have a type of decline and destabilization, so to say, to have these deeper transitions, that this makes it easier for stakeholders, civil servants, politicians to first of all address this more explicitly, because it's often overlooked, so to say, strategically and on purpose, because that can be a pretty painful discussion to address the losers, for example, and costs of transitioning, even if it's a, so to say, very much wanted or societally aspired transition. Then this downwards facing decline curve particularly addresses stranded assets, high invested costs that you have to deal with. Just to give one practical example, Drift is involved in the mobility transition of the city of Rotterdam. And one concrete intervention that's a topic basically globally is, so to say, getting rid of parking space or access for cars to some parts of the city, right? To basically move towards car-free districts or neighborhoods. You see this in a lot of cities around the globe. And one, so to say, political measure to do that is to reduce parking space in public space. So to basically reconfigure parking lots or parking space. However, and now I get to the point of that decline curve, parking space management is a substantial income generator for municipalities. And for example, for the city of Rotterdam, we roughly talk definitely about more than €1 million or more per year of income generation through parking space management. And that's a quite delicate topic to then say, well, let's ban the cars out of the city, because this income generation for the municipality would basically be gone then. And this X-curve, as Kai said, is at least a door opener to start addressing such issues more explicitly, I would say. Jana.
Thanks, Gijs. It was a very interesting presentation, and I don't think you need to worry about your online presence. It worked well for me. My question is related to, obviously, the current crisis, which many perceive as a potential crisis which can trigger change even when we overcome the actual pandemic right now. Do you see specifically in the context of the circular economy that there are areas in which this current crisis could actually trigger things to sort of, which were actually on your lower curve, the innovations, etc., that they now could become more prominent in other areas which you would see as having been affected negatively by this current lockdown, which more or less affects most countries in the world at the moment?
Yeah. Oh, and another Friday afternoon question that I would really also like to share with, ask to many of you, because you are probably much more of an expert in the circular economy itself. But I mean, one of the more obvious things that are being said right now is that countries are really reconsidering their supply chains on certain essential goods, right? And try to move certain parts of their production home, which could be, it's not necessarily circular, but could be a important precondition of trying to get more circular production. So that would be, for me, the most obvious one. But I would really like to see this one opened up.
Yeah, so what I noticed amongst my colleagues, which is, again, it's not circular economy related, but a lot of them are talking about maybe this is an opportunity for new ways of producing food, so changes in the food system to actually come forward, that there are new moves of urban food production, of more agroecological approaches, of shorter food chains, etc. I haven't really personally seen any discussion around the circular economy, but maybe anyone else has, and it would just, I think I would agree with opening this up maybe potentially if people are interested.
Yes.
But Kevin also had a question.
I saw Lopa raising her hand. Please unmute yourself, and then also Anna next.
This is Lopa from UK. Just a clarificatory question initially, maybe so takes off the Friday pressure on us. Can you please say a little bit more on the servicification of the economy that you referred to in your presentation? That's the first part. And I'll come back to the second one once I hear what you have to say for this.
Yeah, of course. So I already said I'm not sure if it's the proper word. Maybe some native speakers can help me with that. But you see a lot of movements towards offering products as a service, so that you don't, as a consumer, own the product, but that you rent, lease, or whatever the product. So for consumer products, it can be mobility as a service as an example, where you don't own the car anymore, but you use a shared car. Or it can be a laundry machine, that you don't buy the machine, but that you then rent 2,000 of circles of laundry. I think, do you call it circles of laundry? And in that way, the producer remains owner of the product and can make sure that the materials that are in that product are then being brought back to its factory, and that it's much easier to make a more high-value based recycling. So it doesn't end up in a waste fill where it has to be deconstructed altogether and ends up in like a PET bottle, but it can be brought back to the factory where the producer still keeps ownership of the product.
Thanks, guys. Lopa, you had a second question. There would be time for that. Then I would go to Anna and then Rachel.
Yeah, just a quick one then. Well, hopefully, in your work, how does it engage with the, sustainability literature and the contradictions with circularity? Because essentially, is it about making the circle bigger? The argument around it. Does these solutions that we're looking for is actually making the circle bigger and bigger, rather than actually, which essentially questions sustainability and the trade-offs that we need to make between the environmental, the social, and the economic. So how do these contradictions within these two, in a way, some scholars obviously don't see them together. Sustainability and circularity don't seem to gel together in one group of studies. And so in your work, how do you engage with these tensions?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. And there are people that promote the circular economy as this endless affluency, a model in which we can grow and thrive forever without really taking the more like degrowth elements of the consumption society into consideration. How we take that into account, and I didn't spend enough time on this, but I talked way too long already, is when we start this X-curve exercise, the first thing you do is to really get that future vision straight, right? So what's at the end of that upgoing curve? What type of economy are you envisioning? Is that also a sustainable circular economy, and what does that imply? Does that mean also maybe consuming less, consuming local? All these things can be there. And if you have that future vision clear, it becomes much more obvious what is on the upward trajectory and what is on the downward trajectory. So if that sustainability vision is really central to such an X-curve exercise, these overconsumption elements of modern economies, I think you're referring to, are definitely the things that need to go.
Thanks, guys. Yes, thanks, guys. I have Anna next, but Rachel had an immediate response to that particular question. So I would ask Rachel for a comment, and then I will go to Anna, and then Kevin afterwards.
Yeah, I just realized that I thought I could answer like 3 questions in one. So first, Gijs, I've heard mostly servitization with a T, but maybe your word also exists, but you asked for a native speaker's opinion on that. And Dan asked about the winners and losers, and Lopa about the servitization. So one example that I've come across in practice is that the same Ministry of Infrastructure and Environment wants to become fully circular in their furniture by, I forget what year, but in any case, the loser in that transition would be, of course, the people who are building furniture pieces. And so what they're doing to sort of convert these losers into potential winners of this transition is to invest money in retraining these people instead of building furniture to be able to repair furniture, and then they can still be contracted by the ministry. So it's kind of, yeah, a way of making a societal transformation, but also making sure you tie all of your loose ends up.
Thanks, Rachel. Anna, please.
Hello. Hi. Thank you so much for presentation. It's really good. And I also like cats on the background of.
Good.
It seems they are very interested in this topic as well. Yeah, but my question's about producers. Yeah, because it's very important to focus on design products and how we can encourage producers to focus on design their products and also to responsible on lifetime of these products, and maybe to work more with academical people who can help to design products sustainably, using sustainable materials, make products like repairable, reusable, and etc.
Yeah, the million-dollar question, I think, right? How do we get people to now really start at the beginning of the circle and think about what their design should be like? So I'm not an expert on the business side of things here, but what I see policymakers trying to do in this project we worked on is really now get towards the phase where we can institutionalize certain principles in, well, law, basically. So a practical example is in the Netherlands, building is quite highly regulated. Like, to build a new house has to be really done according to a certain standard. And now they want to include circularity principles in that standard. But the big bottleneck is now what are the standards for a circular building? They are not there yet. But what is quite inspiring to see now is that because they have that vision of where they want to get at, is that they now gave themselves 4 years until 2023, so 3 years now left, to actually from the building companies and universities working on that, give a list to the government saying, okay, these are going to be the standards that we want you to institutionalize, to make them into law, because they really need that for their they need a standard. Otherwise, they will all have different principles, and it's so difficult. But then I can see that being very difficult with consumer products, because they have very international supply chains, and you cannot do that as easily as within a housing market that is often more domestic.
Yeah, I can just tell that, for example, we discussed this a lot of questions on circular economy workshop at Royal Engineering Academy in London. And for example, one of the problem we can remember, for example, fridge that was produced like 50 years ago or even more. It can work for 100 years, no problem. Nowadays, unfortunately, many products, they produce it only for specific certain time, like 1 year mobile phones, 2 years, 3 years. It's
Yeah, the built-in redundancy.
Yes. I think we can learn a lot from the past, definitely.
That's a very good point. If I may pick this up and summarize this, in one of our other projects on social innovation, one of the takeaway messages was that innovation is not at all always about novelty and creating something radically new, but it's also about, so to say, re-identifying and re-innovating or reinventing and building on things that have been there already. I saw the information that Kevin raised his hand. Kevin, if you want to come up with a question, and then Esther would be next.
Yeah, thank you very much, and thanks, Gijs, for the presentation. I've been mulling over the X a great deal, and I like the idea of thinking differently around the amount of effort. That's a really interesting way of trying to understand some indicators, some, I guess, outcomes along these journeys. It makes lots of assumptions about the pathways, and I'm sure you've got lots of theory around how those pathways are created. What's interesting to me is what happens in the middle, in that transition, in that actual intersection. What does that look like? We've used a lot of examples here which are linked to issues, but not probably looking at whole systems. And the pathways may look very different to whole systems. And maybe we've got to really unpack this in terms of scale. And it may look very different when we start looking at it at different scales. If I look at it at a more macro scale, I'm really worried about what I think about in terms of my assumptions about the pathways, how emergence and chaos somehow meet in the middle, and whatever happens there, I don't quite know as to how we then get onto those transitions. And I wondered, my question is really centered around what's that center look like? What's in there?
Okay, I'll try to give a very concrete example of what that looks like from a circular economy's standpoint, and it's very small. But for instance, a lot of packaging companies want to move towards biodegradable packaging. And that is now moving into something quite big, now relatively big. So it's emerging as an alternative. At the same time, we still have like a lot of recycling of traditional plastics. And when they mix, the traditional plastics cannot be recycled anymore because it destroys the process, and the biodegradable plastics don't end up where they need to be, where they need to end up to be actually biodegradable. So there is a bit of a very difficult phase you end up in, because what do you need to do then? Do you need to make all these policies that deal with like a very time-constrained period where there is still a lot of normal plastics and the biodegradable plastics, and that you then separate those streams, or do you just let it be because, you know, it's what happens when there's chaos and we just need to accept it? And I think in waste management there are many more of those examples, right? I think that I'll stop talking, but I think that's what happens. Difficult decisions to be made by policymakers.
Yeah, thanks, guys. A very clear example. Kevin, maybe you want to quickly add on your reference to the question of scale. Was that referring to questions of scaling certain emergent solutions and how that may play out, or also in terms of other understandings of scale?
Yeah, I think the scaling question is a difficult one, and here is probably not a Friday afternoon discussion right now. But I mean, I think we've looked at it's easy to look at examples like waste management, and I think we can understand that a lot easier at a more macro level, at how we influence institutionalization and the idea of servicing a service-based economy. It becomes a little more complex, and things we'll certainly discuss in this project going forward, I'm sure, because that's probably the nub of some of our challenges that we're facing here. Thanks.
Thanks, Kevin. Esther, please.
Yeah, just a comment, just to clarify. I completely agree that we need good policy theories, like eco-innovation one, yeah? But I would like to comment, and please, our presenter, make a comment too. It's not only the X curve. I completely agree with it. But for us and for me, we have now the challenge to reach the cross point after the cross point. And how to do this is our questions. Well, it's the challenge for all the people who works with transition systems, of course. But we have been assuming that there is a public choice need in this case. It's not possible only to think about the traditional policy making. I think you will agree with me, but I think we need much more discussion about this, because how to involve people, how to have an agent-based modeling in which the agent expectations, for instance, to adopt a new technology to foster innovation diffusion in order to have less waste of food, yeah, in countries like Brazil or in Netherlands, doesn't matter. How to assume not only theoretical concepts, but how to make this concerning the question that the Belmont Forum will ask us some results, some practical actions, and how to involve these people. Well, we have been assuming that some agent involvement, like the Elinor Ostron's, the economist, yeah, from Institutional Economics, in which you have a lot of discussion with the technology adopters, not only in policy making sectors, yeah. So it's only a comment. I think
no,
we will have. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Esther. That's a very good point, and I allow myself to combine it with a question that Dan posed on the chat, and maybe Gijs, you can comment on that together, so to say, because Dan also asked, with whom were you or are you co-creating? So who were these stakeholders? For example, civil servants, but also Dan would be interested in hearing about the dominant private sector actors and how they were brought into such discussions, or could be brought into such discussions. And that refers also to Esther's point in how to engage agents and how to bring in the diversity or plurality of voices and preferences into such processes.
So I'm going to take two answers to this question. First of all, I acknowledge that transitions are not only about policy, but these are societal changes, and to bring them about, you need a broad network of actors to make these changes happen. But we took a slightly different approach and moving away from that more societal aspect in this project. And I'll explain briefly why. And this is something we're doing now, so I couldn't present yet. But in the Netherlands, at least, the default approach towards managing transitions has been to reach out. So they take a very much a approach of a facilitating or networking government. So they try to see, what's going on in the society? How can I facilitate your movement towards circular business models or a good recycling behavior, etc. Or they take a more networked approach where they take the big private actors and invite them to the table and try to create a Green Deal or a common agenda for the circular economy together with all. And what they often forget is that traditionally the role of government has been much more performance oriented. So we're going to set standards, or we're going to create green circular procurement programs. We're going to actually lead the way in this transition and invite others to join, or be even more regulatory, right? So just ban things or and really put an end to certain practices that are not part of that new circular economy. And governments, or at least the Dutch government, has been very hesitant in taking on that role as more, well, I guess Mazzucato would call it an entrepreneurial state, or at least the public sector was a bit more confident about what role they play in this transition. So yes, I agree. I think the basics of transition studies is to take a more societal approach. And I think Timo and Rachel can tell you a lot of projects where we applied this types of thinking with broader coalitions of actors. In this particular project, we took a very much policy-oriented approach, and within that policy-oriented approach, we actually pushed government to let go of their first reflexes of moving to society, engaging all the private actors, engaging the nice initiatives that are taking on the ground. They've done that for 10, 20 years now. Let's see what they can actually do in terms of performing and regulating and taking that more traditional government role. So a bit contrarian, maybe.
Thanks, guys. There's a second question by Dan. Maybe, Dan, if you unmute, you can also tell us.
Okay, thank you. It's really, really very interesting, this whole area, and I really would like to take this conversation forward somehow, and it's very relevant not only to this project, but to our other program, actually. And it makes me think, actually, we're going to be having conversations with Tao-Yan next week on the macroeconomics, and anyway, there's a whole bunch of stuff which I won't go into, but on this particular, I don't really know the answer to this, but I've put on there in the notes, is there a way of creating a manageable crisis? Because I kind of think of, the example of vaccination in the body. You create antibodies to react against the vaccination. So a small scale kind of crisis in order to react against it. In urban development terms, there's an exemplar in southern Germany called Freiburg, which has very low levels of car use, very high levels of walking and cycling, organic supermarkets everywhere. Apparently it's not replicable, but it is an amazing example of healthy urban development. But it was made possible originally because they proposed to put a nuclear power station in that area, which united the conservative rural dwellers and the liberal city folk. So it was actually the proposal to put a nuclear power station on their doorstep that created the environment that enabled them to react in that way. So I don't know the answer to this, but I just wondered if you'd had any thoughts about how you might be able to create those crises, but in a more manageable way.
I think it's it's another Friday afternoon question, right? Sorry to say that. No, it reminds me at a question that we had in one of our earlier consortium meetings, which was simply put, do we need the chaos to get the transition done, so to say? And if so, how could we go with moderate chaos, so to say, or could we initiate a crisis light or something like this? I think that's a very fair and relevant question. But first of all, maybe back to Gijs, and then we can hear other opinions on that.
Yeah, let's definitely open up this question, because I think it's the excellent question to open up. I think it's very difficult to create a crisis on purpose with secondary intentions. You can go for a shock, right? I just close off a highway, I don't know. But what we do sometimes do as an exercise is think of what crises could actually trigger this transition. So we call this a wildcard exercise, something like that, where we really make people think of, okay, what would happen to your particular field if, I don't know, a pandemic appears, right? So all these expected surprises, because these are expected surprises. We know that they are they could really happen, and there are many of them. We do have that sometimes as a playful exercise to play around with these thoughts, and then you're more ready when something like that does come up.
Can I just respond to that, Timo? Just because that's kind of the line of thinking where I was going along. You know, how do we use risk management more effectively? You know, Greta Thunberg talking about, you know, saying panic, you know, and getting people to actually, and the role of national government. I mean, in the UK, for example, we have a national risk register, which has had pandemics as the most severe and likely risk to the entire country for the last 7 years. And yet it seems that we're not very well prepared for it. So what role is there for city and national government to actually be much more proactive in terms of their risk management approach and the education of people with regards to risk management and all those scenario planning and all that? I guess that's where I was going with the kind of, you know, you create a crisis by getting everyone to run around going panic.
Just in terms of process, I suggest we open this for the next 3, 4, 5 minutes, but then I have 2 more points or questions. One from Matt, I would call you in a few minutes then, and then Ulrich. But before getting to those 2, maybe we stick a couple of minutes to that issue of, is it also ethically a good idea to somehow stimulate system crisis, and how might we do that? Or could it be an interesting pathway to think about moderated chaos, or even getting through this core of a transition phase without major destabilizations and chaos? Maybe if you raise your hand, I'm happy to get some more opinions and comments on that. Yes, Rachel, please unmute yourself.
Yeah, so I would already like split hairs a bit on what you said, because you asked if it's possible to have this core of a transition without destabilization and chaos. And what we've been talking about is a transition without a crisis. And so from my interpretation of the X curve, there is always this destabilization and chaos, because that's just an inherent phase where the regime starts to break down a bit and they start to incorporate new ideas. And then chaos inherently happens even if there's no crisis, because it's something new. It's something where like whoever's in the transition is learning to navigate. That's my first point. And my second point would be, I think it relates to Sue's question from the beginning, was, yeah, do we need this crisis for transition to happen? And my answer would be that I think crises can accelerate transitions and they can spur them on, they can be the catalyst, but I don't think they're necessary. My first thought was just, I'm reading this book called The Power of Habits, and it's really interesting, but one part about it was the first CEO of one of these production companies who incorporated safety as a measure, whereas before everyone was focusing on turning profits and things like this, and so everyone thought this like new CEO was some kind of crazy hippie, and they all de-invested because they thought the company was going to go down the drain. But what they realized, or like what happened in the end, was after they focused on all these safety measures, the habits translated as well. So they started to do their work better as well. There was better morale, less people had injury time off, things like this. And so in the end, the company did turn huge profits, more than they could have expected if they only focused on the financial aspect. And because this guy was so successful, that's why now in any company basically where there's any sort of risk, you have these safety measures and like X amount of days without an accident, something like that. And so to me, that's an example of a societal transition. Now this focus with holding importance on safety without having had a crisis occur. Done.
Further comments or questions on that particular aspect? Yes, Adina and Lopa.
Well, it may not have been a global crisis, but maybe something that triggered the company to focus on safety is that there were injuries and there were concerns about safety. So it's a matter of scale here of what you define as crisis. It could be something that is internal to that company or something more global, but I think that crisis aspect is still there to some degree, because otherwise there is less of a motivation to change. Everything is well. People don't typically in their nature seek change. I mean, for example, we've been talking for ages about video conferencing to lower carbon footprints, and we haven't done anything until now because of the corona thing. So, you know, it's something that is definitely people were talking about and thinking about, and it's crisis that actually made us transition.
Yes, thanks, Adina. Lopa, yes.
Yeah, I think that going back to what Rachel said, I think it's not necessarily transitions are crisis driven, because it can also be driven by changing needs, changing perceptions, which is much more to do with innovations. Basically, what we are talking about here is actually a new way of dealing with things without having been in a crisis. It's not necessarily crisis driven. It's just that you find it might be time efficient, resource efficient, or particular reason. So I guess that is the idea the transition is much more a longer term process, much more about societal changes, and what we're talking about is innovative ways of doing things. So possibly, so we're talking about both the niche innovations and transitions in the same breadth. I think those are quite different things that we are talking about, different type of processes and action. They might have similarities, but they're also different in many respects. So I think, yeah, that's my comment on that.
Thank you. I see Ian. Please go ahead.
Just to follow a little bit on that, there's crises and crises, aren't there? There's everything ranging from emergencies and calamities through to catastrophes and absolute devastation. It strikes me that it's the idea of, is this something that's a temporary thing? Are we going to restore our normality? Or are we actually in a permanent change through this crisis? And I think that's really where we are with this virus problem at the moment. It can be seen from many people, it's a temporary thing, we will get back to where we were before. But many others are seeing it as this is a paradigm shift, it's a complete movement into something new. And I think it's really quite important to distinguish where we are on that spectrum, in a sense of whether this is something that's going to make a huge long-term change, or whether it is just something to be got over and the resilience concept of just bouncing back to where you were before. Because if it is just that, then the existing regime is going to do its utmost to push us back and keep us where we were, rather than the opposite, which is shift to something new, which will be better, hopefully. But I think the nature of the crisis is something which would be very important to dig into.
Thank you, Ian. I think that's an important point you mentioned about the nature or character or type of crisis to differentiate there. Yes, Gijs, please go ahead. You're muted. You're muted.
I was muted. Just a brief comment on this. Maybe we think of crisis as something that's very exceptional, and maybe we should stop doing that. So rather than asking the question, do we need a crisis to transition? We can turn it around and say, well, a transition takes a long time. In that period, we will definitely experience a number of crises that will affect this transition, either positively or negatively, as I think Ian just also underscored. And briefly on the chaos phase, I think chaos might always be a part of it, but it depends like how big the chaos is and how long that period of chaos takes, right? And I think that's the challenge for society to transition and then to minimize the amount of chaos you get, because that's, I guess, something you don't want.
May I?
Yes, Sue. Oh, I'm sorry. Sorry.
Yeah?
Okay. First Esther,
No?
and then Sue, please.
No, it's only to think about the chaos or crisis. For me, we have been living the tragedy of commons. It's not only chaos, because the perception about chaos is very difficult to define. For instance, in our case, what kind of chaos the rainforest, the Atlantic rainforest, it's nature. There is no perception about my neighbor doesn't know about the problems of food production at the frontier of the rainforest. So I think the better way to understand is to talk about the tragedy of commons and the irrationality of decision making, but it's too big for now.
Thank you, Esther. And I think hearing you speak also in this meeting here, just a remark for the consortium members. I would love to see such a debate coming back to the nexus of transition theory and Elinor Ostrom's work. I think that would be fantastic if we could dig a bit deeper there. So I really appreciate, Esther, your comment on the tragedy of the commons and how we may translate that into also our transition perspective. Sue, you were next.
It was just to, I thought you were going to trip me up there, Timo, because it was just to bring us back to our own project, the food, energy, water nexus. And I know I brought up this business of crisis, and then we brought in the idea of chaos. But in terms of the food, energy, water nexus, where is our crisis? What is the chaos? You know, again, it's up to discussion, isn't it? But I would find it difficult to put my finger on what crisis we face before the COVID-19 one. So I guess that's just something for us to discuss, unless people have got comments to make.
Thank you, Sue. It's a very good point. Maybe Jana immediately on that one. And then I still have Matt and Ulrich with concrete questions or comments. So Jana, please, and then I would go to Matt.
I think just to follow up on what Sue said about the question of what is the crisis, what is the chaos around the nexus, I also think what is actually the vision, where we want to head to, for example, with Bristol, with Sao Paulo, etc., with all the different sites, what is actually the vision of what we want to achieve in an ideal world scenario. And I think that then also links to what we talked about earlier. I think Lopa raised that it shouldn't just be around changing things in a circular or nexus kind of way, but also the scale of consumption, of production, etc., should be part of this vision, hopefully. And that's just, yeah, adding to what maybe we should also work on with our other partners and stakeholders around this question of what is a potentially shared vision for the different either urban living labs or city regions or whatever the scales we are looking at.
Thanks, Jana. And I was also thinking about our work package 6, where we want to work with scenarios, and obviously we could also think about in that context about so to say what might be future pressures or more exogenous landscape developments that really would make a difference in terms of a massive destabilization of the existing linear economy pattern, so to say. All right, I would ask Matt Johnston to come to the point that you already mentioned in the chat. Maybe if you want to unmute yourself, please go ahead.
Thanks, Timo. And hi, everyone. Sorry for joining late. I'm not going to show a video. My connection isn't so good. I just want to bring into the works the question of inequality. And I think from a South African perspective, it's really interesting to see what the crisis is doing. But my question is specifically, I mean, it's useful in that it's making explicit a lot of implicit value hierarchies in South Africa. Now, for example, I mean, there's an issue of financial scarcity and a lack of economic growth, and we've already been in a crisis before this one occurred in a financial sense. And now the question is, I want to ask Gijs, did you address the issue of not jeopardizing productivity in areas where economic growth is really imperative? Because I know we're linking this to the degrowth discussion, but in a place like South Africa, that's really not on the table at the moment. For example, they're speaking about repurposing rehabilitation funds in the mining sector for expenses on health and health infrastructure in the context of what's happening. So I just don't want to get kind of lose that aspect in the different aspects of sustainable development.
So I can answer that quickly because I think it's of course a fundamental question, and it's also a very central part of the project we do with the government. Because for some reason, in the Netherlands at least, the circular economy has been quite extracted from any more broader debate on the social dimensions of it, right? For some reason, it is still very much framed as an economic opportunity. And so we have an entire chapter exploring 4 social issues around it. I think it's public support, inclusivity, social innovation, and behavioral changes. And it is still shocking to see how not far-sighted most people think in this regard. So when it comes to the issue you talk about, the social issues around production and people that are maybe that don't want to be confronted with a new economy that is based on degrowth. But in terms of, the reference of mine to the policymakers in the Netherlands was still very much about, okay, maybe if we have a more circular economy, then we have more labor-intensive jobs that can then bring production to the Netherlands, which is still a very limited view of what social dimensions are actually part of this broader discussion. So we have tried to open this up, but the context in the Netherlands is vastly different from the context in South Africa, I think, in that sense.
Okay, thank you. I would ask Ulrich, you were also active on the chat, and you also mentioned the degrowth concept a while ago, and you also now refer to the aspect of behavior change or change in social practices. Yeah, the floor is yours.
Yes, yes. Yeah, thank you. I mean, this was just a comment. I really enjoyed the discussion this afternoon. Yeah, so the degrowth things, it goes more into, you know, almost like is the transition and circular economy movement radically enough in a way. Just some of the degrowth thinking is a little bit muddled, I think, in a way, in the understanding if it would exclude growth completely. But one of the kind of key understanding is of this Georgescu Roegen, which is like an economist from Romania, who basically said that the world is limited, therefore you cannot really physically grow any further. And a lot of the kind of earlier business models, you know, even if we go back to the very first one you showed about the exploring the planet, there were always kind of no limits. You could go to America, Australia, and conquer another world. But now it's kind of clear in a way that there are no other worlds, and at least not on this planet, and all the others around, you know, in the solar system are also not habitable. That's something we also know. So in some way, the overall assumption that you can always fix something by growing somewhere else and moving out is gone. And that's the kind of the way I understand degrowth, so that you kind of decouple yourself from this idea that you could grow somewhere else all the time. And I think it's a little bit more radical than than the circular economy idea in itself. But anyway, that's the question. So I wanted to know what your views are on there, including, I think, the interesting view that a lot of countries in the world still want a lot of growth. South Africa for other reasons as well, while others, degrowth has been mainly developed in Italy for kind of obvious reasons, because the population is already shrinking there a lot. Yeah, so this is the question.
Good. I leave this open for the group. So here's the notion of degrowth, and any comments on that? Any opposing arguments or critical reflections about it?
Well, as a short comment, I'm always a fan of the terminology of A-growth rather than degrowth or growth, but that's maybe a bit of a linguistic tug of war.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah, if I can add my comments, my reflections, because I think degrowth, as far as I understand, it's not about not having growth. It's just that it is more focused on making it more equal, more inclusive, more equitable. So yet, which can be done without scaling up. So I think that different notions within degrowth scholar literature. So I think it is confusing. It's conflating different type of issues. The issues in the developed context where it's overproduction and consumption and very unequal growth. I think the attention of degrowth literature is to bring about these deficiencies, this overall lack of concern towards sustainability. And so in a context where it is on a much lower scale and more sustainable, clearly the questions and issues are not so much about not having growth, but making sure it's actually bringing back attention to what matters most. It's not simply unlimited growth that we are looking at, which seems to have become a dominant trend. So I think that it doesn't prescribe one approach, one solution to all the problems for all contexts. So I guess, so that's why, yes, so I don't think the word degrowth actually captures, because it tends to give you the idea that we don't want any growth at all. It is what type of growth that we are envisioning or having as a policy or as whatever for any government. So whether it's South Africa or whether it's India or UK, we might need growth, but we're questioning what type of growth, for whom, and how. And those are the sort of questions which it asks.
Thank you, Lopa. I just want to point to the time. Formally, we have 5 minutes left. At least that's my information, that we go until 5 o'clock European time, Central European time. I currently have the feeling we could continue, not forever, but even more. That's a pretty good sign for a Friday afternoon webinar. So congratulations to us, so to say. Nevertheless, are there any urgent last questions or comments? That would be the moment to come up with it now. Dan, was that yes? Please go ahead.
Sorry, just would I be able to get hold of the slides, or are you going to be able to share those slides? That'd be great. Thank you.
That's a yes. Still time to maybe go for one more question or comment from the group. Yes, Sue, please.
I was only going to say thank you very much for an extremely interesting and well, very interesting presentation, and it generated so much discussion. And I think that, you know, behind the scenes, we're going to be talking about this for the best part of some time. So, you know, thanks very much indeed. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Well, thank you. was my pleasure. It's always such a nice way to structure your own thoughts if you have to present them. We're getting the hang of this webinar thing, so that's also a good thing. I thought it was very nice atmosphere that felt much more intimate than I thought it would. And I also hope that Rachel and Timo will keep me up to date on all the progress you are making with this project.
Yes, and what I suggest is when Gijs and myself briefly prepared or discussed some ideas around how to structure the session, and particularly the later discussion, there was this idea of using this X-curve model somehow to reflect upon our own project, or at least some of the regions that are in the project. We didn't get there yet, I want to say, but I would suggest to take that into some of our next meetings, and maybe for a next consortium meeting, hopefully taking place in person in South Africa, which is still under question. That could be a concrete point to work with, just to use that as a template, so to say, and reflect upon the regions or the project. All right, I thank you all for being here. I also enjoyed it very much, and I think, yeah, let me thank Gijs again. It was really a great input and very stimulating for the discussion, as you could see. I wish you a wonderful Friday afternoon, or still day. And maybe Adina, do you want to close officially, or is that fine if I...
Yeah, just say enjoy your Friday beers. For in California, it's our morning coffee, but have a good weekend and stay safe.
Yeah, stay safe and healthy, and hope to talk to you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye, thank you. Bye.
Thank you very much. Bye.